Ladies and gentlemen, I want to speak to you about something that many of us often misunderstand: isolation. When life seems to separate you from the crowd, when relationships break down, and when the world grows quiet, it can feel like punishment. But let me assure you today, when God isolates you, it is not rejection, it's preparation. You see, isolation is a divine strategy. God does not pull you aside to abandon you. He pulls you aside to align you. He uses isolation to refine, recalibrate, and reintroduce you to the world in a way that serves his purpose. The question is not why me, but rather what is God doing in me? Let me remind you of Moses. He was isolated for 40 years in the wilderness before he could lead Israel to freedom. David was isolated in the fields tending sheep before he was called to the palace to become king. Even Jesus, the Son of God, spent time in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. What do all these examples tell us? Isolation is the birthplace of transformation. 1. Isolation reveals identity. When God isolates you, he removes the distractions of people and their opinions. He silences the noise so that you can hear his voice clearly. It is in those quiet places where you discover who you truly are, not who the world says you are, but who God created you to be. Sometimes he has to take you away from the crowd to show you your crown. 2. Isolation builds intimacy. In the stillness of isolation, you begin to cultivate a deeper relationship with God. When you have no one else to lean on, you learn to lean on him. When there's no one else to turn to, you turn to him. Isolation is not a sign that God is far from you. It's a sign that he wants to draw nearer to you. 3. Isolation prepares you for elevation. Before every major breakthrough, there's always a season of isolation. Why? Because God needs to equip you in private for what he's about to do through you in public. He shapes you, molds you, and prepares you for the next level. He isolates you not to destroy you, but to develop you. 4. Isolation tests your faith. Faith is not built in comfort zones, it's forged in the fire of solitude. When you're isolated, you're forced to trust God like never before. You learn to walk by faith, not by sight. It's in those moments of loneliness where your dependency on God grows stronger and your faith matures. Friends, if you find yourself in a season of isolation, don't resist it, embrace it. Don't mistake it for punishment, recognize it as preparation. God is setting you apart because he has set you aside for something greater. So instead of asking, why am I alone? Ask, Lord, what are you teaching me in this season? Instead of saying, why did this happen to me? Declare, God, I trust you in this process. Remember, diamonds are formed under pressure. Eagles soar alone before they reach the heights, and seeds must be buried in darkness before they break through the soil to bear fruit. God isolates you because he sees what you can't see yet. He's working behind the scenes, orchestrating something extraordinary. Trust the process, trust his timing, and trust his plan. Your isolation is not the end, it's the beginning of your transformation. And when God is finished, you won't just re-enter the world, you'll do so with purpose, power, and a testimony that will inspire others to trust him in their own seasons of isolation. Isolation is a divine mechanism God uses to reveal identity, often in ways we cannot comprehend in the moment. It's a process of pulling you away from external influences, distractions, and the opinions of others to bring you face to face with your true self. In the noise of life, our sense of identity can become tangled in the expectations, labels, and judgments placed upon us by society, friends, and even family. Isolation, though uncomfortable, serves as the sacred space where God removes these layers to reveal who we truly are in him. It's not an act of cruelty, but of clarity, a way for God to bring us back to the essence of who he created us to be. In the Bible, we see this pattern repeatedly. When God had a significant purpose for someone, he often isolated them first. Take Moses, for example. Raised as a prince of Egypt, he had wealth, status, and influence, but none of these reflected his true identity. When he fled into the wilderness after killing an Egyptian, he found himself in a state of isolation. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd in Midian, far removed from the grandeur of Pharaoh's court. During this period, God stripped away the false identity imposed on him by his upbringing and revealed the leader, liberator, and prophet he had called Moses to be. It was in the wilderness, not the palace, that Moses discovered who he truly was. In isolation, God does a deep work within us, removing the masks we wear and confronting us with truths we often avoid. The solitude creates space for introspection, prayer, and a deeper connection with God. Without the distractions of the world, you're forced to grapple with your thoughts, emotions, and spiritual state. This process can feel disorienting because it challenges the comfort zones we cling to. However, it's in this discomfort that God begins to reveal your purpose and identity. The false labels you've carried, whether imposed by others or self-inflicted, start to fall away, leaving room for God to speak his truth over your life. Consider David, the shepherd boy who would become king. Before he ascended to the throne, he spent years in isolation, tending sheep in the fields. While others saw him as just a boy, God saw a king. In the solitude of the fields, David developed skills, character, and a relationship with God that would sustain him through the challenges of leadership. He learned to trust God in the quiet moments, to fight lions and bears with courage, and to worship with an undivided heart. All of this was preparation for his destiny, but more importantly, it was in the isolation that David's identity as a man after God's own heart was solidified. Isolation wasn't just a test, it was the environment where God revealed to David who he was and what he was capable of. Sometimes we resist isolation because it feels like abandonment. We equate being alone with being unloved or forgotten. But God's isolation is not rejection, it's redirection. It's his way of removing you from environments that distort your perception of yourself. In isolation, you are no longer defined by your achievements, relationships, or roles. Instead, you're confronted with the question, who are you, when everything else is stripped away? This question is not meant to unsettle you, but to guide you toward discovering the identity God has placed within you. It's an identity rooted in his purpose, not the opinions of others. Jesus himself experienced isolation, most notably during his 40 days in the wilderness. Before he began his public ministry, the Spirit led him into a place of solitude and fasting. In the wilderness, Jesus faced temptation, but he also affirmed his identity as the Son of God. The enemy tried to question this identity, saying, if you are the Son of God, but Jesus, grounded in his relationship with the Father, resisted these attempts to undermine who he was. His time in isolation was not wasted. It was a period of preparation and affirmation. It was in the wilderness that Jesus solidified his mission and emerged ready to fulfill his purpose. Isolation is a process of refinement. It's like gold being purified in the fire, where impurities rise to the surface and are removed. In the same way, God uses isolation to refine your identity, stripping away the things that don't belong to reveal the purity of his design. This process can feel painful because it often involves letting go of relationships, habits, or mindsets that no longer serve God's purpose for your life. But as these things are removed, what remains is the core of who you are, your true self, as God intended. In today's world, where social media and constant connectivity dominate our lives, the concept of isolation can feel especially foreign. We're accustomed to seeking validation from likes, comments, and followers. Our identities are often shaped by how others perceive us rather than by who we are in God. Isolation disrupts this cycle. It forces us to step away from the external noise and seek validation from the only source that truly matters, our Creator. And in isolation, God reminds us that our worth is not determined by our popularity, productivity, or possessions. It's rooted in the fact that we are his children, created in his image for a divine purpose. One of the greatest challenges of isolation is facing your fears and insecurities. When you're alone, there's no one to distract you from the doubts and lies that may have taken root in your heart. But this is exactly where God does his transformative work. He confronts those lies with his truth, replacing fear with faith and insecurity with confidence. Isolation becomes the setting for inner healing, where God restores what has been broken and strengthens what has been weakened. It's a process of renewal that prepares you to step into your purpose with clarity and conviction. During isolation, you also learn to hear God's voice more clearly. In the busyness of life, it's easy to miss his whispers. But in solitude, his voice becomes unmistakable. He speaks to you about who you are, who he is, and what he has called you to do. This divine communication is essential for understanding your identity. God's words are life-giving, affirming, and empowering. They remind you that you are fearfully and wonderfully made, that you are chosen and beloved, and that you have a unique role to play in his kingdom. As you embrace the process of isolation, you begin to see yourself through God's eyes. You start to shed the limiting beliefs and false narratives that have held you back. You realize that your identity is not defined by your past mistakes, your current circumstances, or other people's opinions. Instead, it's defined by God's grace, love, and purpose for your life. This revelation is liberating because it allows you to step into your true identity with confidence and courage. Isolation is not a destination, but a journey. It's a season that God uses to prepare you for what's next. During this time, he equips you with the tools, wisdom, and strength you'll need to fulfill your purpose. He reminds you that your identity is not found in what you do, but in who you are in him. This understanding is crucial because it anchors you in truth, no matter what challenges or opportunities come your way. In isolation, God is not just revealing your identity, he's also reshaping your perspective. He's teaching you to see yourself as he sees you, not through the lens of human judgment, but through the lens of divine purpose. This shift in perspective is transformative because it changes how you approach life. You no longer seek validation from the world, but rest in the assurance of God's approval. You no longer strive to fit into societal molds, but embrace the unique path God has laid out for you. Isolation is a gift, even though it may not feel like it at first. It's a sacred space where God meets you, shapes you, and reveals the depth of his love for you. It's a place where you learn to rely on him completely, to trust his process, and to walk in the identity he has given you. Through isolation, God prepares you to step into the fullness of your calling, equipped with a renewed sense of purpose and an unshakable understanding of who you are in him. Isolation is one of the most profound and transformative tools God uses to build intimacy with his children. It is in those quiet, often lonely moments where we feel disconnected from the world that God draws us closer to himself. The process of isolation can be uncomfortable because it removes us from the familiar, but it is within this sacred stillness that God's presence becomes undeniable. In isolation, God strips away the noise and busyness of life, creating a space where we can truly encounter him. It's not just a time to be alone, it's an invitation to experience his love, his voice, and his presence in ways that are otherwise drowned out by the clamor of daily living. The very nature of intimacy requires focus and exclusivity, and that is what isolation offers. It removes the distractions that vie for our attention, relationships, responsibilities, and the ceaseless demands of the world, and creates an environment where our attention can be fixed entirely on God. In this place of solitude, there is no room for pretense or performance. God meets us as we are, with all our fears, doubts, and vulnerabilities laid bare before him. It is in this vulnerable state that intimacy with him begins to flourish. Because intimacy is not built in crowds, it is cultivated in private moments where our hearts are fully open to him. Throughout scripture, we see that God often calls his people into isolation to build this kind of deep personal relationship. One of the most striking examples is the story of Elijah. After the prophet's dramatic confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, he fled into the wilderness overwhelmed by fear and despair. Alone and despondent, Elijah found himself in a state of isolation. But it was in this solitude that God revealed himself in a profoundly intimate way, not in the powerful wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. That whisper was a reminder that God's presence is not always found in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments where he speaks directly to our hearts. Isolation often feels like a separation from what we know and rely on, but it's actually a deeper connection to the one who sustains us. When we are pulled away from the external sources of comfort and support, we begin to understand that God is our ultimate source of strength and provision. This understanding is not merely intellectual, but experiential. In isolation, we come to know God not just as a concept, but as a living, personal presence in our lives. We begin to see that he is not just a distant deity, but a close, caring father who desires an intimate relationship with his children. Consider Jesus' example. Throughout his earthly ministry, he frequently withdrew to isolated places to pray and commune with the Father. Even though he was surrounded by crowds and constantly sought after by people, Jesus understood the necessity of solitude for maintaining his connection with God. These moments of isolation were not acts of avoidance, but deliberate choices to prioritize intimacy with the Father. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed time alone with the Father, how much more do we? His example teaches us that isolation is not a sign of weakness, but a pathway to strength. It is in these quiet times that our relationship with God is deepened and our spirits are renewed. When God isolates us, he is not removing us from the world to punish us. He is drawing us into a deeper relationship with him. Isolation becomes a sacred meeting place where we learn to hear his voice and sense his presence in ways that are transformative. In the quiet, we begin to recognize his whispers amidst the noise of life. His voice becomes clearer, his love more tangible, and his guidance unmistakable. These moments teach us to trust him in ways we never could when surrounded by the distractions and affirmations of others. Isolation also forces us to confront the things that may hinder our intimacy with God. In the stillness, we become aware of the idols we've placed before him, whether they are relationships, ambitions, or even our own self-reliance. These moments of awareness are not meant to shame us, but to bring us to a place of surrender. In surrender, we lay down what we've been holding on to and allow God to take his rightful place at the center of our hearts. This act of surrender deepens our intimacy with him because it reflects our trust and dependence on his love and provision. Another powerful aspect of isolation is that it allows us to experience God's sufficiency in our lives. When we are isolated, the things we often rely on for fulfillment, whether it's people, work, or material possessions, are stripped away, leaving us with nothing but God. And in that place of emptiness, we discover that He is more than enough. His presence fills the void, His peace calms our anxieties, and His love satisfies the deepest longings of our hearts. This realization transforms our relationship with Him, moving it from one of duty to one of delight. We no longer seek Him out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to be close to the one who truly completes us. The intimacy that is built in isolation has lasting effects. It strengthens our faith, deepens our understanding of God's character, and equips us to face life's challenges with confidence. When we've encountered God in the quiet, we carry that sense of His presence with us into the chaos of life. We begin to see that intimacy with Him is not confined to moments of isolation, but becomes a continuous reality that shapes how we live, work, and relate to others. The time spent alone with God becomes the foundation upon which our entire relationship with Him is built. Isolation also teaches us the value of stillness. In a world that glorifies busyness and constant activity, stillness can feel uncomfortable, even counterproductive. But it is in stillness that we truly come to know God. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." This verse captures the essence of what happens in isolation. When we cease striving and allow ourselves to simply be in His presence, we come to a deeper knowledge of who He is. Stillness creates the space for us to encounter God in ways that are transformative, renewing, and life-giving. In isolation, God also reveals His heart to us. As we draw closer to Him, we begin to understand His desires, His plans, and His love for us and the world. This understanding changes how we see ourselves and others. We begin to align our hearts with His, and our priorities shift to reflect His will. The intimacy built in isolation doesn't just affect our relationship with God, it transforms every aspect of our lives. It shapes how we think, speak, and act, allowing us to become more like Christ. Isolation, though challenging, is one of the greatest gifts God gives us. It is in these moments of solitude that we come to know Him in ways that are impossible in the noise of life. The intimacy that is built during these times is not fleeting but enduring, carrying us through both the highs and lows of life. It is an intimacy that grounds us, strengthens us, and equips us to live out our calling with purpose and passion. Through isolation, God invites us into a relationship that is not based on circumstances but rooted in the unchanging reality of His presence and love. Isolation is one of God's most profound methods of preparing you for elevation. While it may feel like a setback, isolation is often the foundation for the extraordinary work God is doing in your life. It's a process designed to separate you from distractions, refine your character, and prepare you for the new heights He has planned for you. In isolation, God creates a space where transformation happens, a place where He can work on you away from the opinions, pressures, and expectations of the world. This process is never easy, but it is always purposeful. When God is ready to elevate you, He often begins by removing you from familiar environments, relationships, or situations that no longer serve His purpose for your life. This separation can feel disorienting, even painful, as you may find yourself questioning why certain doors are closing or why certain people are no longer present. But what feels like loss is actually God making room. He's clearing out what isn't meant to go with you to the next level. Elevation requires preparation, and preparation begins with pruning. God isolates you to remove the unnecessary weight so that you can ascend freely. This isolation is not only about what God is taking away, but also about what He is instilling within you. In these moments, He works on your heart, your mind, and your spirit. He builds within you the character and resilience needed for the responsibilities that come with elevation. Without this period of isolation, you might find yourself unprepared for the challenges of the next level. God's goal is not just to place you on a higher platform, but to ensure you can sustain it. Isolation is His workshop, where He molds and shapes you into the person capable of stewarding the blessings and influence He's about to entrust to you. In isolation, you learn to depend on God in ways you never have before. When the familiar sources of comfort and security are stripped away, you are left with nothing but Him. It is in this state of dependency that your faith is strengthened and your relationship with God deepens. You come to understand that He is not just the source of your elevation, but the sustainer of it. This dependency is crucial because the higher you go, the more you will need to lean on God. Isolation teaches you that He is not just preparing a place for you, He is also preparing you for the place. During isolation, God refines your focus. Life is full of distractions, and elevation requires clarity of vision. In solitude, you begin to discern what truly matters and what does not. You learn to hear God's voice more clearly, unfiltered by the noise of the world. This clarity is essential because the path to elevation is often fraught with challenges and decisions that require divine guidance. In isolation, you develop the discipline of seeking God first, ensuring that your steps are ordered by Him. This refined focus becomes your compass as you navigate the journey ahead. Another critical aspect of isolation is the development of your gifts and abilities. Often, God will use this time to sharpen the tools He has placed within you. Just as a musician practices in private before performing on a stage, God uses isolation as a training ground. He equips you with the skills, wisdom, and insight needed to excel at the next level. This preparation is not just about achieving success, but about fulfilling purpose. Elevation is not for personal gain, it's for the advancement of God's kingdom. Isolation ensures that your motives are aligned with His, so that when you are elevated, you use your position to glorify Him. Isolation also strengthens your character. The process of being set apart can reveal weaknesses, insecurities, and areas that need growth. This exposure is not meant to discourage you, but to refine you. God allows you to confront these areas in private so that they do not become obstacles in public. Elevation brings visibility, and with visibility comes scrutiny. God uses isolation to prepare you for the weight of responsibility that comes with elevation. He fortifies your integrity, humility, and perseverance, ensuring that you can handle both the blessings and challenges of the new level. This period of preparation often involves testing. In isolation, you may face trials that challenge your faith, patience, and obedience. These tests are not meant to break you, but to build you. They teach you to trust God, even when His plans are not fully revealed. They strengthen your resolve and deepen your reliance on His promises. Elevation requires a tested and proven faith, and isolation provides the environment for this faith to grow. It is in the wilderness, not the mountaintop, where trust in God is forged. Isolation also teaches you to appreciate the value of timing. Elevation is not just about where God is taking you, but when He's taking you there. In isolation, you learn to wait on Him, trusting that His timing is perfect. This waiting period is not passive, it is active preparation. As you wait, God works behind the scenes, orchestrating circumstances and opportunities that align with His purpose for your life. Isolation teaches you patience and perseverance, qualities that are essential for sustaining success. When the time for elevation comes, you step into it not out of ambition, but out of alignment with God's will. Isolation often brings clarity about the purpose of your elevation. It's easy to desire promotion without understanding its true purpose. In solitude, God reveals the why behind the what. He shows you that elevation is not about personal accolades, but about serving others and advancing His kingdom. This shift in perspective ensures that when you are elevated, you remain grounded in humility and focused on His mission. God isolates you to instill a sense of responsibility, reminding you that to whom much is given, much is required. Through isolation, God also builds your resilience. Elevation often comes with new challenges, criticisms, and pressures. In solitude, God strengthens your spirit, teaching you how to stand firm in the face of adversity. This resilience is not developed in moments of ease, but in seasons of struggle. Isolation becomes the training ground where you learn to endure, persevere, and overcome. It prepares you to handle the weight of elevation without being crushed by it. One of the most beautiful aspects of isolation is that it reminds you of the source of your elevation. It's easy to forget God's hand in your life when you're surrounded by success and recognition. But in isolation, there's no one else to credit but Him. This recognition fosters a spirit of gratitude and worship, ensuring that when you are elevated, you remain anchored in the truth that it was God who brought you there. This perspective protects you from pride and keeps you aligned with His purpose. Isolation may feel lonely, but it is never without God's presence. In fact, it is in isolation that His presence often feels the most tangible. As He prepares you for elevation, He also draws closer to you, revealing more of His heart, His character, and His plans. This intimacy becomes the foundation of your relationship with Him, ensuring that as you rise, your connection with Him remains strong. Elevation without intimacy with God is empty, but isolation ensures that your ascent is rooted in His presence. When God isolates you, it is a sign that He is about to do something extraordinary in your life. It may not make sense in the moment, but His ways are higher than ours. He sees the end from the beginning and knows exactly what is required for you to fulfill the purpose He has placed within you. Isolation is not a punishment, it is a privilege. It is God's way of saying that he sees something in you worth preparing for greater things. Through this process, you come to understand that elevation is not just about reaching a higher position, but about becoming a better version of yourself. God isolates you to transform you, to equip you, and to prepare you for the destiny he has in store. The journey may be difficult, but the reward is worth it. Isolation is the place where God does his most profound work in your life, ensuring that when he elevates you, you are ready to walk in the fullness of his purpose and glory. Isolation is a crucible where faith is both tested and strengthened, a sacred process that draws the soul closer to God through trials that refine and purify. When God leads us into a season of isolation, it often feels like a separation from the familiar, a detachment from the people, routines, and comforts we rely on. Yet, in that place of solitude, faith is forged in ways that cannot be achieved in the noise of daily life. Isolation strips away external affirmations and forces us to confront the very foundation of our belief. It presents a choice where we trust God in the absence of clarity, in the face of uncertainty, and in the silence of waiting. Faith is not proven in moments of ease, but in times of challenge. Isolation tests our faith by creating an environment where God's presence may feel distant, where his promises seem delayed, and where his plans remain hidden. It is in these moments that doubt tries to creep in, whispering lies that challenge our trust in him. But it is precisely through this testing that faith is refined, much like gold is purified through fire. The impurities of fear, impatience, and self-reliance are burned away, leaving behind a faith that is genuine, steadfast, and unshakable. Consider the story of Abraham, often referred to as the father of faith. God called him away from his homeland, away from everything familiar, into a land he had never seen. This call required Abraham to step into isolation, not only physical separation, but also a spiritual and emotional detachment from his old life. In this place of uncertainty, Abraham's faith was tested repeatedly. Would he trust God's promise of descendants when he and Sarah were childless? Would he obey God's command to sacrifice Isaac, the very son through whom the promise was to be fulfilled? These moments of isolation were not punishments, but divine tests designed to strengthen Abraham's faith. Each act of obedience in isolation deepened his trust in God, proving that faith grows strongest when it is stretched. Isolation reveals the areas of our lives where faith needs to grow. When the familiar crutches are removed, we are forced to confront our dependence on things other than God. Perhaps we have relied on the approval of others for validation, on our own abilities for success, or on material possessions for security. In isolation, these false sources of strength are exposed, and we are given the opportunity to place our trust fully in God. This process is not easy. It requires us to let go of control and surrender to his will. But it is through this surrender that faith is strengthened. We come to see that God is not just a part of our lives, but the very foundation upon which everything rests. Isolation also teaches us the value of perseverance. Faith is not just about believing in the moment. It is about holding on to that belief over time, even when circumstances seem contrary to God's promises. The waiting period that often accompanies isolation is a test of endurance. Will we continue to trust God when the answers don't come quickly? Will we remain faithful when the path ahead is unclear? It is in these prolonged periods of waiting that faith grows deep roots. Just as a tree's roots grow deeper in search of water during a drought, our faith becomes more grounded as we cling to God in the dryness of isolation. In the wilderness of isolation, we also learn to discern God's voice more clearly. When life is filled with noise and activity, it can be difficult to distinguish his guidance from our own desires or the opinions of others. But in the quiet of solitude, his voice becomes unmistakable. This clarity strengthens our faith because it removes the doubt and confusion that often accompany decision making. We learn to trust that when God speaks, he is faithful to fulfill his word. This trust becomes the anchor for our souls, keeping us steady even in the storms of life. Isolation also allows us to experience God's provision in ways that deepen our trust in him. When we are removed from the systems and structures we usually depend on, we are placed in a position where only God can provide. This dependence reveals his faithfulness and strengthens our belief in his ability to meet our needs. Consider the Israelites in the wilderness. For 40 years, God provided manna from heaven, water from a rock, and guidance through a pillar of cloud and fire. These miracles were not just about meeting their physical needs, they were lessons in faith. Each day they gathered manna was a reminder that God is their provider, and each step in the desert was an opportunity to trust his leading. Isolation challenges us to believe in God's goodness even when circumstances suggest otherwise. It is easy to praise him when life is going well, but true faith is revealed in the trials. Will we declare his goodness when the promotion doesn't come, when the relationship ends, or when the healing seems delayed? In isolation, we are faced with these questions, and our responses reveal the condition of our hearts. This testing is not for God's benefit. He already knows the depth of our faith, but for ours. It shows us where we need to grow and invites us to lean more heavily on him. Another profound aspect of isolation is that it shifts our focus from what we see to what God has said. Faith, after all, is the evidence of things not seen. In isolation, we are often stripped of tangible signs of progress, forcing us to hold on to God's promises rather than visible outcomes. This shift strengthens our faith by teaching us to walk by faith, not by sight. It reminds us that God's word is more reliable than our circumstances and that his plans are higher than our understanding. This kind of faith is unshakable because it is rooted not in what is temporary but in what is eternal. Isolation also cultivates a deeper level of intimacy with God, which is essential for strengthening faith. When we are alone with him, free from distractions, we come to know his heart in ways that transform our belief. We experience his love, his grace, and his presence on a personal level. This intimacy builds confidence in his character, assuring us that he is not only capable but also willing to fulfill his promises. Faith is not just about believing in God's power, it's about trusting his love. Isolation gives us the space to develop that trust, anchoring our faith in his unchanging goodness. The strengthening of faith in isolation is not just for our benefit, it prepares us for what lies ahead. God uses these seasons to equip us for the challenges and responsibilities of the next level. Faith that has been tested and proven in isolation is faith that can withstand the pressures of elevation. It is faith that can move mountains, inspire others, and bring glory to God. The lessons learned in isolation become the foundation for the victories to come. They remind us that the God who was faithful in the desert will be faithful in the promised land. Isolation may feel like a lonely and difficult season, but it is a divine appointment. It is where faith is refined, strengthened, and prepared for greater works. It teaches us to trust God in the silence, to hold on to his promises in the waiting, and to depend on his provision in the wilderness. Through isolation, we come to understand that faith is not a passive belief, but an active trust in the one who is always faithful. It is in this sacred process that we are transformed, equipped, and ready to walk into the fullness of his purpose for our lives. Isolation is one of the most misunderstood experiences in life, often perceived as punishment when, in reality, it is divine preparation. When God separates you from the familiar and places you in a season of solitude, it is not to harm you, but to prepare you for something greater. It is his way of refining, equipping, and transforming you for the destiny he has designed. Isolation is never wasted in God's hands. It is a strategic process through which he molds your character, strengthens your faith, and reveals his purpose. Though it may feel uncomfortable, the isolation is not meant to diminish you, but to prepare you for elevation. It is in these moments of separation that God's work in your life becomes the most profound. Throughout Scripture, we see countless examples of God using isolation as a tool for preparation. Before Joseph became a ruler in Egypt, he endured years of isolation in a pit and in prison. Before Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, he spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep. Before David ascended to the throne, he spent time in caves, hiding from King Saul. And even Jesus himself, before beginning his public ministry, spent 40 days alone in the wilderness, fasting and being tempted by the enemy. Each of these seasons of isolation was not a punishment, but a necessary period of preparation. It was during these times that God worked behind the scenes, shaping his chosen ones into vessels capable of fulfilling their divine assignments. Isolation strips away the distractions and noise of life, creating a space where you can hear God more clearly. In the busyness of everyday life, it can be difficult to discern his voice. But in solitude, the stillness allows you to connect with him on a deeper level. This clarity is essential for understanding the direction he is taking you. When God isolates you, it is an opportunity to recalibrate your heart and mind, aligning them with his will. It is in this quiet place that he begins to reveal his plans, giving you insight and wisdom that will guide you in the next season of your life. Isolation becomes the environment where his purpose for your life is made clear. One of the most important aspects of isolation is that it allows God to work on your character. Before he elevates you, he needs to ensure that you have the integrity, humility, and strength to sustain the blessings and responsibilities that come with the next level. Isolation is a time of refinement where God addresses the areas of your life that need growth. It is in solitude that he exposes the flaws, fears, and insecurities that could hinder your progress. This process is not meant to shame you, but to transform you. God's goal is to purify and prepare you so that you are ready for the weight of your calling. In isolation, you also learn the value of dependence on God. When you are separated from the people, systems, and structures that you usually rely on, you are forced to place your trust fully in Him. This dependence strengthens your faith and deepens your relationship with Him. You come to realize that He is your ultimate source of provision, strength, and guidance. This understanding is crucial because the journey ahead will require unwavering trust in His ability to lead you. Isolation teaches you that God is not just a part of your life, He is your life. This revelation becomes the foundation upon which you build everything else. Another key purpose of isolation is to prepare you for the challenges of the next level. Every new season comes with its own set of trials and responsibilities, and God uses isolation to equip you for them. Just as a soldier undergoes rigorous training before entering the battlefield, God uses isolation to strengthen you spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. He sharpens your skills, increases your resilience, and builds your capacity to handle more. The isolation may feel like a delay, but it is actually a divine setup for success. God is ensuring that when the time comes for you to step into your purpose, you will be ready to thrive. Isolation also teaches you patience and perseverance. When God places you in a season of waiting, it is not to frustrate you, but to develop your character. Patience is a vital quality for anyone who seeks to fulfill God's purpose, and it is often cultivated in solitude. Waiting on God teaches you to trust His timing and to remain steadfast in your faith, even when the outcome is not yet visible. This perseverance is what sustains you during difficult times and keeps you moving forward when challenges arise. It is in the waiting that your trust in God is deepened and your character is refined. During isolation, God also tests your motives. He examines the intentions of your heart, revealing whether you are seeking Him for who He is or for what He can do for you. This testing is not to condemn you, but to purify your desires. It is an opportunity to realign your priorities and ensure that your focus is on Him rather than on worldly achievements or recognition. God wants to know that your heart is fully devoted to Him, that you are seeking His will above all else. Isolation becomes a time of sanctification, where your motives are purified and your relationship with Him is solidified. Isolation is also a time of preparation for spiritual warfare. The higher the calling, the greater the opposition, and God uses isolation to prepare you for the battles ahead. In solitude, He teaches you how to pray with authority, how to stand on His promises, and how to resist the attacks of the enemy. These lessons are critical for maintaining your faith and focus when challenges arise. Isolation becomes a training ground where you learn to rely on God's power rather than your own strength. It is in these moments that your spiritual muscles are strengthened, equipping you to overcome any obstacle that comes your way. Isolation often feels lonely, but it is in these moments of solitude that God's presence becomes most tangible. When you are stripped of external support, you begin to experience Him in a more personal and profound way. His love, peace, and comfort become your anchor, sustaining you through the challenges of the season. This intimacy with God is one of the greatest gifts of isolation. It is a reminder that even when you feel alone, you are never truly alone. God is with you, guiding you, comforting you, and preparing you for what lies ahead. Through isolation, God also teaches you the importance of obedience. He uses this time to give you specific instructions and to test your willingness to follow them. Obedience in isolation is a demonstration of your trust in Him. It shows that you are willing to walk by faith even when you cannot see the full picture. This obedience is crucial because the next season of your life will require you to step out in faith, trusting that God's plan is better than anything you could have imagined. Isolation prepares you to take those steps with confidence, knowing that He is leading the way. Isolation is not an easy process, but it is a necessary one. It is during these times that God does His deepest work in your life, shaping you into the person He created you to be. The discomfort of isolation is a small price to pay for the transformation it brings. When you emerge from this season, you will be stronger, wiser, and more equipped to fulfill your purpose. The isolation is not a punishment, but a gift, a time of preparation that sets the stage for your elevation. God is not withholding from you. He is investing in you, ensuring that you are ready to step into the fullness of His plan.